is the right approach that we should pursue. I would yield back.
Chair thanks the gentleman. Gentleman yields back. Chair recognizes the gentlelady from New Mexico.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. And, I think it's really important to bring back to this discussion issues that Americans can understand if they are watching on C-SPAN. And you know what? Several of them do. It's amazing how many people come up to me and say, I saw you on C-SPAN. I'm going, who watches C-SPAN? But they do. And something that I think they very much understand is that what we are pursuing here with these extreme cuts that are not consistent with the Fiscal Responsibility Act, it hurts our communities. They understand it. When I'm talking to my rural communities, and I talk about an ag appropriations bill that takes us back to, was it 2007 levels, Ranking Member? They understand it when we talk about an environmental protection and the cuts to those bills that take us back to the 1990s. They understand it when we talk about cutting education. Chair, I know, I have a huge rural district. Everybody who comes before here always has to learn about my beautiful rural district, right? And I love the communities I represent. They are Title I schools, Chairman. And you mentioned earlier that in terms of looking at these cuts, so many of the Title I schools are in big cities. But I don't really care if those Title I schools are in big cities or they're in the beautiful communities that I represent and I come from. Wouldn't you agree that a child, regardless of the wealth of their parents, regardless of how hard those parents might work and how little or lot they might bring in as a paycheck, that every child deserves a quality public education?
Well, let me just mention, as I did in my statement, that there is estimated that over $20 billion are still as unspent, still remains for these provided during the pandemic to these schools. And it is just our opinion from the appropriation standpoint, from the majority side, is until this funding is drawn down, that it's used responsibly, then we should not continue to make further investments in.
But what I think that ignores is that in my districts, our schools are responsibly pulling down and spending money, but that these Title I schools, that the cuts you're making, and is it 80%, Ranking Member? Yes. Imagine any school that is relying on that funding to all of a sudden have 80% less funding. And some schools might not be using it as quickly as others, but imagine those schools that are relying on it to get 80% less funding from one year to the next, what it means. In my district, we've looked at it. In New Mexico, we've looked at it. It is a lot of teachers. It is a lot of teachers, and you've recognized that it's teachers in your district as well. Do you have an idea of how many teachers might be cut in your
I don't
district?
have any number of hand, but again, when there's money that is in the government that's not being used, then that's where, as Congressman Roy mentioned, we have to find some of the cuts somewhere, and this is one of the places that we.
But once again, you were taking this macro and saying not everybody's using this money, so we are going to cut all schools, right? Am I right, Ranking Member? That they don't say if you haven't utilized the money, you don't get the new money until. This is a cut to the schools. And by the way, you might go back and talk to your teachers. You will have 3,700 teachers in Alabama could lose their jobs because of the bill you're proposing. In New Mexico, we're a smaller place at 764 Title I schools. In New Mexico, it is so many of my schools. It's over 700 of the schools in my district, and in New Mexico will lose their funding. I cannot let that happen. So that's why I must join with our Ranking Member when she says no. And that's why when, or the good gentleman from Texas goes on and on about these different monies and this and that, it confuses everybody. And what's he yelling about? And there's a lot of yelling that comes across. And I like it, Ranking Member, when you calmly share the grave implications of this bill. Because we don't need to yell, as we heard. I think we just need to communicate what will happen to things we care about. Head Start. I'm a Head Start baby. I do not think it is a conflict of interest to continue to advocate for quality early childhood education. Chairman, you know that quality early childhood education makes a big difference in a child's life, right?
I'm sure, yes.
Right,
I'm
you
sure it
know,
does.
I mean, we have great studies. Mr. Chair, if I may move into the record, Head Start, the public preschool program, more than pays for itself.
Without objection, so ordered.
Because this shows that when we spend $1 on a child, when they're 4, 5, when they're ready to go to school, but their parents might not have the money, that it pays for itself, and then more, we get so much more back. You know, and then when we talk about, so, you know, here's the early childhood kid, the little 4-year-old. Then we have our Title I, our K through 12 schools, cutting. Then we have those kids who might want to go and get, become welders. They might want to become dental assistants. You would agree, I'm sure, that we should support whether you want to go to college or whether you want to go get your journeyman's license, whether you want to go to community college to become a dental assistant, that we should support those. Wouldn't you agree?
I think you certainly you can make that argument, and but I'm just, you know, the problem is that we have, you know, and from the preparation standpoint and from this nation, is that we have to find the cuts somewhere, and in order for this to move forward, and when there's money that's still on the table, we're trying to look at, because there's a lot of programs in here that we didn't cut, and that we tried to make sure. But
Well, I
at the
don't
end
know.
of the day, you know, we did have to make some cuts, and they're very hard. I mean, in a perfect world, this, you know, we would not be doing a lot of the things we're doing in this. But we are not we have a $33 trillion debt in this country, and it's not a perfect world. And so we do have to make some hard decisions. And this is some of the places that we're going to have to make them as we move forward. And like I said, you know, I by no means say this is a perfect bill, but we're under very unusual circumstances in this country right now with the debt that we have, and that we're not even trying to make some changes. And I think it's time that we do make some changes and some cuts in this country. And we sometimes have to make those hard decisions.
So this is the thing about we have to cut. Like, to say over and over again, we have to cut, when one, cutting at these levels, cutting at 28%, is not consistent with the Fiscal Responsibility Act. Cutting at 80% of those programs that are most in need is not consistent with a must-do. And when we talk about revenue, every time you guys come up and we have the Republicans talk about revenue, you know, I have a wonderful chart that I have entered into the record before, and we will enter into the record again, that talks about the cause of that deficit. And the cause of that deficit were the tax cuts that went primarily to the wealthy and the corporations who still don't pay. And they began with Reagan, they continued with Bush, they continued with Trump, and that if we didn't have those tax cuts, we would be at a level playing field now. And I think that that's it, that it is not a we have to cut. You are choosing to cut. And when you choose to cut from those most vulnerable, from those who have told me, come and fight for me, go and take your voices, that's when I need to raise my voice just a little bit about this isn't right. And it's not right. And you said in your opening as well that, you know, it's because of inflation. We have this big issue with inflation. And, you know, I need to address that one as well, because we have the Federal Reserve, the Kansas Federal Reserve, has done a report that says that 60% of the inflation came not because we were helping people keep a job when the pandemic was so dark. Do people remember how dark it was in those dark days of the pandemic? We need to remember how dark it was. People were losing their jobs. They were afraid. And we did, with the American Rescue Plan, make sure that our downtowns did not shutter, that people had unemployment, that they had jobs. But what caused inflation? Putin's war. And so for those of you who are unwilling to help Ukraine, remember, when Putin invaded Ukraine, he caused some of that inflation. Remember that. 60% of the inflation in this Federal Reserve report comes from corporate greed. right? And we know that there are record profits being made. So when you tell me we need to cut, it's not teachers who are causing inflation. When you talk about inflation, it's not teachers that are causing inflation. It's the corporate profits. And if we could only collect some of that tax revenue, and that's what you were speaking to, is that right, Ranking Member, when you were talking about the need to collect?
We need to collect the revenue.
The taxes that are owed. So, it's been a long night, and I would seek unanimous consent, Mr. Chair, to enter into the record the two articles, including the report on the by the Kansas Fed noting that profits were responsible for 6% of inflation.
Without objection, so ordered.
So, early childhood, all of those programs that the ranking member summed up, as I see this, HR 5894 literally steals the future of our kids at every age, whether they're a 4-year-old who wants to go to Head Start, a 6th grader who lives in a poor community, whether it's an urban neighborhood, a rural one, and goes to a Title I school, or a 17-year-old who's trying to train for a new job. I look at this, and I see that those are your priorities, and I need to say they can't be mine. And so I will be urging and voting against both the rule and the bill. And then going quickly to the rule on the CR. Oh my God, here we are again, right? Here we are again, like at a point where we are a few days out from a government shutdown, And it didn't have to be this way. That's what the whole purpose of the Fiscal Responsibility Act was, right? Ranking Member, is so that we wouldn't have to go through this.
No, we did that. It was a deal that was agreed to overwhelmingly in this body, and as I say, and then immediately it was rebuffed. We also had a continuing resolution that we moved forward, which gave us another 45, 47 days to do something. And during this period of time, the time was squandered to bring up. I'm all for bringing up bills and doing something, but we've had one bill that failed, two which couldn't make it, and yet we're continuing this trajectory, which I said earlier. The ironic part of my testifying here today is that I'm talking about a CR, which a continuing resolution, which they say is going to address this, issues in the future, and at the same time, we are going down the same path to perdition with a bill with amendments, most of which get defeated, which will go nowhere. And who knows? I think the chair said that he doesn't know whether or not there will be the votes for the bill, and that we get to the point after going through hours and hours and hours, that the bill then has to be pulled from the floor, like the two that were last week. And then we have two more coming up this week, and those two could be in this very same position. As a matter of fact, these two bills did not even go through the full committee to get marked up with unbelievable amendments. The time has been squandered. We should now be focused on an allocation coming from the budget agreement with each of the subcommittees. Let the House and the Senate appropriators hammer it out like we have done in the past in order to pass appropriations bills that will fund the government for 2024. My real fear is that, I said this earlier as well, there is a trigger that goes into place on January 1st, which goes back to the, takes defense down to 850, increases non-defense to 736. That is only temporary. When the bills are passed, we go to the non-defense once again, goes back to its dollar amount. Defense goes up. But that process, 44 days in which nothing has been done. If you transfer that, we could be into April before, and we would just see 6 months where there is no budget for 2024 as well. And that is a reality. We cannot dismiss that, given the nature of the bills and the cuts that we are talking about, into trying to come to some sort of conclusion on where we should go. And not conclusion, some sort of a meeting of the minds, compromise. We win some, colleagues with, we go back and forth, which is what we have done in the last 2 years with the appropriations bills to get them funds. And you know what? We don't need an omnibus bill. We can do minibuses as we have done in the past. So that this notion that you have to go in that direction is just really kind of spurious. It's just made up. We can come to a conclusion. Let's get the appropriators focused on the bills and get away from this madness which will occur over the next 2 days or 3 days on the floor of the House.
Thank you very much, Ranking Member. And the chaos and confusion that is being created with the constant flirtation with the government shutdown is not good for America. It's not good for our allies. It's not good for anybody. It is bad for our economy. It's bad for the trust in the system. Chairman, I saw you voted for the Fiscal Responsibility Act. Your ranking member did not, but she is willing, and I hope you are willing to work on a bipartisan basis to move us beyond this point. And with that, Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Chair thanks the gentlelady. Gentlelady yields back. Chair recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Langworthy.
Thank you very much, Mr.